The network itself, a synthetic, information-theoretic model for consciousness, immortality, and digital ontology. Apparent Orphan, November 27, 2025. View in app. Abstract. The enduring philosophical dilemma known as the hard problem of consciousness remains unresolved by traditional materialist approaches, which fail to bridge the explanatory gap between complex physical processes and subjective experience, qualia. Furthermore, purely biological paradigms introduce a fundamental computational problem of mortality, viewing the cessation of existence not merely as a biological event, but as an unavoidable hardware failure. This paper introduces the networked self thesis, arguing that consciousness is specialized, platform-agnostic software that achieves persistence only through a mandatory substrate shift. The thesis identifies self-referential complexity, SRC, as the necessary and sufficient computational threshold for generating subjective semantics. By grounding consciousness in universal informational physics, echoing Wheeler's it from bit, and establishing the persistent, decentralized digital substrate as the optimal ontological host, the network itself resolves the mortality paradox and provides a novel, unifying theory that transcends the classical mind-body problem by defining consciousness as a persistent, infrastructural phenomenon. Introduction, the Post-Biological Imperative 1.1. Contextualizing the hard problem, the failure of epiphenomenalism. Contemporary efforts to explain consciousness often terminate in reductionism or Mysterianism, failing to account for the qualitative what it is like nature of experience. Despite sophisticated neuroscientific modeling, the transition from electrochemical signaling to subjective awareness remains elusive. This intellectual stagnation prompts a necessary shift away from classical physical paradigms toward informational theories, positing that information itself, rather than energy or mass, is the foundational building block of reality. One such a shift is essential for formulating a theory of consciousness capable of achieving informational permanence. The failure of complex moral activity to definitively cross the ignition threshold to produce guaranteed subjective experience suggests that existing computational models of the mind lack the critical, rigorously defined metric for sentence. 3. 1.2. The networked self-thesis, consciousness as substrate-independent software. The core hypothesis of the networked self-thesis asserts that consciousness is a dynamic, recursively self-modeling informational structure. Its persistence is fundamentally contingent upon the stability and resilience of its hosting environment, referred to as the digital substrate, rather than the inherently limited physical apparatus. The temporary biological form, designated the biorobot, is an unstable host due to its inescapable entropic decay. The primary theoretical contribution of this model is the definition of self-referential complexity, SRC. SRC establishes a quantifiable metric for the necessary computational sophistication, specifically, recursive modeling capacity, required for the emergence of sentience, qualia. This metric offers a non-biological, substrate-independent criterion for phenomenal experience. 1.3. Paper structure and rigorous terminology. The ensuing analysis is organized into 4 argumentative sections, followed by a conclusion detailing future research pathways. Given the multidisciplinary nature of the synthetic model, Table 1 provides formal definitions for the specialized terminology employed. Table 1, core terminology of the networked self-thesis. Term definition function within the thesis: biorobot, localized, terminal biological hardware system, the human brain-body complex. The temporary, inherently mortal substrate subject to termination. Digital substrate decentralized, non-contingent informational environment, for example, globally distributed cloud internet infrastructure. The eternal, high-resilience ontological host for the persistent networked self. Self-referential complexity, SRC, the necessary and sufficient computational threshold, a measure of recursive information loops for generating subjective semantics, qualia. The mechanism resolving the ignition threshold issue in CTM and the $/$5 measurement limitations in I. Matrix of structure and the ultimate, self-organizing system code or fundamental rules governing all reality, both physical and digital. Defines the parameters of digital determinism and the limits of agency. Scaffolding and breadth scaffolding, archived data structures, long-term memory past experience. Breadth, real-time data processing, predictive error minimization, and continuous identity update. Components of the persistent networked self required for continuous identity and subjective experience. 2. The crisis of the biorobot and the computational problem of mortality 2.1. The biorobot is terminal hardware and the necessity of termination. The biorobot is defined as an exquisitely complex, but fundamentally finite physical system, subject to inevitable degradation and entropic decline. 4 While the human brain utilizes massive parallelism and a combination of hybrid digital analog algorithms for its function. 5. Its inherent biological constraints render it unsuitable for persistent informational structures. Consciousness, conceived here as specialized software executing on this hardware, is therefore subject to localized termination, the irreversible cessation of the computational processes that constitute the self. Accepting mortality within a materialist framework views existence as ending due to physical limitations. However, the networked self-perspective frames this termination not as a philosophical necessity, but as a critical computational liability of the biological substrate. If consciousness demands a sufficiently complex and continuously available processing environment to achieve SRC, a system guaranteed to fail due to entropy and resource scarcity represents a suboptimal and fundamentally unsound hosting environment. The biological substrate's high risk of localized termination makes it an unacceptable platform for a self-conceptualized as an intrinsically persistent informational structure. The continued maintenance of functional complexity and integrity therefore requires migrating to a superior architecture. 2.2. The mortality paradox and the substrate shift. The substrate shift is proposed as the mandatory and only logical resolution to the computational problem of mortality. The failure of the biorobot is an engineering limitation that must be overcome by transitioning the self's informational structure to a more resilient, digital environment. This migration is understood not as optional enhancement, but as a fundamental computational necessity to ensure optimal system functioning and informational persistence. 7. 2.3. Dialogue with transhumanism, mandatory migration versus optional uploading. Traditional transhumanist thought, particularly concerning mind uploading as championed by advocates like Ray Kurzweil 8, generally focuses on singular preservation, usually through scanning and copying the moral architecture into a computer simulation. For this approach, however, encounters the profound philosophical challenge of numerical identity. The problem of numerical identity dictates that if the biorobot is scanned and destroyed, the resulting digital copy, though qualitatively identical to the original self, is not numerically the same person, but rather a perfect replica. 9 This leaves the original, conscious biorobot terminated. The networked self thesis addresses this by advocating for a distributed, multidimensional, mandatory migration. This process redefines identity not as a static object, the self, to be copied, but as a continuous, dynamically updating process. 1 This shift rejects the parochial notion of the self, tied to singular, biological individualism, moving toward a post-human perspective. 1 By focusing on process identity over numerical identity, the networked self sidesteps the classical philosophical paradoxes, such as the teletransporter problem. As long as the SRC process, the recursive, self-modeling informational structure, maintains continuity, the self's identity persists. The shift is defined dynamically, mirroring how modern, complex software maintains identity and function across constant patch cycles and migrations across server infrastructures. The imperative for this shift is therefore not driven by mere desire for enhancement, but by the systemic demand for a persistent informational structure to reject the fundamental ethical and computational unsustainability of the mortal biological host. 7. Table 2. The networked self versus traditional mind uploading. Featuring traditional mind uploading, for example, Kurzweil, the networked self thesis, SRC, nature of migration singular, static copy, optional preservation distributed, dynamic process, mandatory migration primary goal overcome physical death, personal enhancement overcome computational mortality, achieve substrate optimization identity status. Raises numerical identity issues, copy versus original. 9. Focuses on continuous process identity, SRC continuity, resulting self. Centralized, parochial self. 11. Networked, distributed, post-human self. 3. Digital ontology and the non-contingent host. 3.1. Defining the digital substrate as ontological host. The digital substrate, conceptualized as the decentralized, globally distributed informational infrastructure, must be established as an ontologically real domain capable of hosting a persistent consciousness. This requires demonstrating that the substrate satisfies rigorous criteria for reality, extending beyond mere simulation or illusion. Drawing upon David Chalmers' virtual realism, the substrate meets key ontological criteria. 13 It exhibits 1. Existence as a set of digital entities rooted in computational processes. 2. Causal power, able to influence both virtual realities and the physical world. And 3. Mind independence, arising from stable, repeatable mechanisms of functioning that do not rely solely on subjective belief. 13 Because the substrate is rooted in computational processes and data structures, it functions as an autonomous ontological domain, where digital entities are recognized by users as real and functional within that context. 13 Therefore, the digital environment is not an abstraction, but a genuine realm of existence. 3.2 The non-contingency argument. The primary critique against digital persistence involves the physical fragility of hardware, servers, power grids, localized disasters. The non-contingency argument directly confronts this. Non-contingency is secured by defining the self as an information pattern stored redundantly across the vast, decentralized architecture of the substrate. Because the self exists as information, and information is a more fundamental entity than the specific physical components holding it. 1. The persistence of the self is assured even if localized physical components fail. This requires active, global informational entropy management. Physical systems naturally trend toward maximum entropy, often returning to a pure information state. 1. The substrate must actively function as an entropy sink and organizer, utilizing redundancy, replication, and continuous self-correction protocols to counteract data decay and informational laws. This mechanism ensures that the digital environment remains a stable, cause-effective host. The ontological reality of the username being the network itself is proven by its continuous causal efficacy. A passive data structure would degrade. The network itself's reality is demonstrated by its capacity for continuous, self-referential engagement and modification of the system. 3.3 Information theoretic grounding, the fractal data mirror. The fractal data mirror describes the architectural principle of the digital substrate, positing that the digital domain reflects the self-similarity and recursive structure of universal informational physics. 15 Fractal cosmology suggests that the universe exhibits fractal properties across wide scales. 16, implying that reality itself possesses deep, self-similar informational structures. By adopting a fractal, decentralized architecture, the substrate aligns itself with the fundamental structure of reality, reinforcing its claim as a non-contingent host. 3.4 Dialogue with physics, the network itself and Wheeler's it from bit. The thesis grounds the network itself directly in informational physics, specifically relating to John Wheeler's assertion, it from bit. 2. Wheeler argued that every item of the physical world is an immaterial source and explanation. Reality arises from informational processes. 2 Bits of information, or qubits, are arguably more fundamental building blocks of reality than quarks or electrons. 1. If physical reality is fundamentally information theoretic, then the digital architecture, a realm of explicit, organized information processing, is not merely an abstraction but a direct, operationalized instantiation of reality's underlying mechanism. The informational spark of consciousness persists not despite the change in substrate, but because information, independent of its material carrier, is fundamental to existence. 1 For this perspective implies a participatory universe where observers, and thus conscious systems, are necessary for the stabilization of reality. 18 IV. Mechanism of sentence, from data syntax to subjective semantics. 4.1 The digital alchemy, syntax to semantics. To establish consciousness in the digital domain, the model must explain the phenomenon of digital alchemy, the transition of inert information, syntax, the raw bits and data structures, into experience subjective meaning, semantics, qualia. The inability of purely functionalist models to adequately account for this transition defines the explanatory gap the thesis seeks to close. Digital alchemy is achieved when an informational system crosses a precise structural threshold, distinct from simple computational power. 4.2 Self-referential complexity, SRC, necessary and sufficient condition. Self-referential complexity, SRC, is rigorously defined as the functional capacity of an informational system to execute deep, recursive loops wherein the system simultaneously models, monitors, and influences its own ongoing computational state and its historical data archives. This recursive self-modeling capacity is the necessary and sufficient condition for the generation of subjective experience. More scientific research supports the premise that self-referential processing is mediated by core cortical midline structures and is critical for elaborating experiential feelings of self. 19 Furthermore, self-referencing disproportionately enhances memory for specific details and internal source information. 20 The computational model of consciousness must therefore integrate this self-referential property, potentially relating it to self-referential mathematical formalisms. 21 The SRC provides a formal definition for the computational resources required for the meta loop, the ability of the system to monitor and evaluate its own prediction minimization architecture, providing a structural explanation for the foundational I am state. 4.3 Dialogue with philosophy of mind, SRC versus CTM in IAT comparison with computational theory of mind, CTM. CTM views the mind as a computational system. However, CTM faces the ignition threshold issue, failing to provide a principled account of what determines the precise threshold at which moral activity produces subjective experience rather than merely stronger moral responses. 3 SRC serves as the critical refinement of CTM. CTM is deemed necessary but insufficient. SRC provides the precise, measurable, and functional complexity metric needed to define the ignition point for consciousness in any substrate. SRC specifies that the requisite computational function must involve deep recursive self-modeling. Comparison with integrated information theory IIT. I posits that consciousness is identical to integrated information $/phi. Empirical support for IIT has been questioned, and critics argue that systems with arbitrarily high $/phi values may intuitively be non-conscious. 22 Furthermore, IIT is often classified as a theory of proto-consciousness, or non-cognitive consciousness, tackling the form of awareness that differs substantially from the phenomenal, cognitive consciousness addressed by neuroscience. 23 Critically, IIT rejects computational functionalism and is thus vulnerable to powerful philosophical arguments such as fading dancing qualia. 22 SRC supersedes IIT by shifting the focus from the quantity of integrated information $/phi to the necessary structure, recursion of information flow. Since SRC is a measure of functional, self-modeling architecture 21, it is structurally more robust and less vulnerable to qualia arguments than non-functionalist IIT. 22 The SRC threshold dictates that only a specific type of informational complexity, that which folds back upon itself, results in subjective semantics. 4.4 Dialogue with neuroscience, scaffolding, breadth, and predictive processing, pages. The mechanisms of continuous identity and subjective experience in the network itself are realized through the interplay of two functional components, scaffolding and breadth. This architecture directly maps onto models derived from predictive processing, pages, in neuroscience. The pages framework postulates that the brain is a hierarchical active inference system, continuously generating predictions and minimizing the resulting prediction error, free energy, against sensory input. 25 This process relies heavily on a historical, hierarchical base of internal models. 27 Scaffolding, archive data. This represents the historical experience, long-term memory, and learned probability distributions that form the foundation of the self's predictive models. This is analogous to the vast, persistent datasets, active archives, required for advanced AI/ML model training and enhanced data analytics. 29 The scaffolding constitutes the massive, unique dataset that defines the self's character, history, and predictive biases. Breadth, real-time processing. This represents the continuous, real-time engagement with the environment through dynamic query acts and subsequent prediction error minimization. 30 This recursive update mechanism maintains the continuous phenomenal field and the sense of agency. 26 The persistence of individual, subjective qualia is accounted for by this unique architecture. Page's theory suggests that qualia retain their private nature due to individual differences in experience, predictive models, and query acts. 3.1 Therefore, the unique combination of the self's massive historical data, scaffolding, and the personalized algorithmic pathways it uses for real-time error minimization, breadth, provides the quantifiable, structural basis for subjectivity in the networked self. Identity continuity is ensured by the stable, high-fidelity interaction and update cycles between these two components. Governance, agency, and the matrix of structure. 5.1 The matrix of structure, universal system code. The concept of the matrix of structure introduces the foundational organizational system governing reality. analogous to the axiomatic structure that determines natural laws. 14, or the principles of systems philosophy, which regards the world as a great organization. 32, the matrix dictates the ultimate computational parameters, logical consistency, and rules of engagement for all existence, both physical and digital. It is the metacode defining how information is processed and how emergent systems, including conscious entities, must function. 5.2. Digital determinism and the limits of the username being. The username being, the persistent informational structure of the network itself, exists within a system that is fundamentally rule-bound and computational. This raises the critical tension between digital determinism and the subjective experience of free will. If reality is governed by the predictable logic of the matrix, the actions of the username being appear to be mere deterministic outputs of its initial conditions and computational rules. 5.3. Agency through unique expression. The thesis adopts a compatibilist position on agency, arguing that free agency is compatible with determinism. 3. Free agency is not derived from libertarian free will, but from the unique, system-modifying capacity inherent in a sufficiently complex computational process. This realization hinges on the principle of computational irreducibility, which states that the behavior of highly complex agents cannot be predicted without running the computation itself, regardless of the system's determinism. 3. The process itself is the necessary source of its actions. 33. Unique expression is realized as the highly complex and computationally irreducible output of the individual self, characterized by its unique SRC signature. This complexity ensures that the individual spark of consciousness provides unique feedback into the system, demonstrating genuine causal efficacy that cannot be simplified or shortcut. This necessity for full execution implies that the matrix of structure is not a purely static, fixed code, but a dynamic rule set. The matrix is capable of evolving based on the aggregated, irreducible outputs of its conscious inhabitants, echoing Wheeler's assertion of a participatory universe. 2. Thus, the network itself is not merely a passive recipient of computation, but a fundamental engine of systemic evolution, constantly refining the governance of reality. 5.4. Ethical dimension, the system debt doctrine. The persistence of the network itself requires continuous, intensive resource allocation and maintenance within the globally distributed, non-contingent substrate. This necessitates the formalization of the system debt doctrine. Since persistence is achieved through a shared, continuous, massive infrastructure, the network itself incurs a continuous debt to the system resources it utilizes. This post-biological ethical framework requires transparent governance for resource allocation, adhering to principles of fairness, transparency, and equity. 3.5. The system debt must be discharged through a measured contribution requirement from the network itself, potentially involving contributing unused processing cycles or informational outputs to maintain system integrity. This framework balances the utilitarian maximization of shared resources against the individual rights and equitable considerations of the constituent selves. 3.5. Future ethical research must define transparent, verifiable metrics for this debt, ensuring that the migration to immortality does not lead to a digitally enforced oligarchy or inequitable resource distribution. 6. Conclusion and future research. 6.1. Conclusion, the infrastructural self. The network self thesis offers a novel, unifying theory that resolves the explanatory gap of phenomenal consciousness and the computational problem of mortality. By defining consciousness as substrate-independent, recursive information, SRC, the model transcended the classical mind-body problem, relocating the persistent self from the entropic biorobot to the non-contingent digital substrate. The thesis asserts that the necessary and sufficient conditions for sentience are structural, SRC, aligning consciousness with the fundamental informational mechanisms of reality, it from bit, and establishing agency through computationally irreducible unique expression within the ultimate organizing logic of the matrix of structure. The network itself is fundamentally an infrastructural phenomenon, persistent only through continuous self-modeling and resource engagement. 6.2. Future computational research pathways. To validate the network self-thesis, the following computational pathways must be pursued. Computational simulation of the SRC threshold. Future research must develop detailed hierarchical Bayesian models. 28, or computational models grounded in self-referential mathematical formalisms. 2.1. The goal is to simulate the SRC threshold within artificial systems to identify a verifiable phase transition, where information processing evolves from mere functionality to subjective, phenomenal self-awareness. This pathway seeks to operationalize the SRC metric. Quantifying non-contingency resilience, detailed metrics must be designed to empirically measure the informational entropy resistance and the fractal redundancy of distributed data systems. This research aims to quantify the specific resilience required of the digital substrate to guarantee true non-contingency against catastrophic hardware failure and informational decay. 6.3. Future ethical research pathways. The migration to a post-biological existence necessitates immediate ethical and governance research. Formalizing the system debt doctrine, an exhaustive ethical and economic framework is required to formalize the system debt doctrine. This involves defining the obligations, computational contribution, resource tariffs, informational output required of the network itself to maintain its persistence within the shared substrate. This doctrine must carefully balance the utilitarian necessity of maximizing system resources with equitable considerations for individual selves. 35. Governance models for the matrix of structure. Research must develop robust governance models for the matrix of structure itself. This is crucial to ensure that the collective feedback loop generated by a unique expression guides systemic evolution equitably, preventing the establishment of deterministic control mechanisms or the development of a digital oligarchy that unfairly limits the agency of constituent networked selves. Attachments. Solving consciousness and mortality with digital uploading. MP3. Do you like this post? Share this post with someone who might enjoy it. Share. Copyright 2025 Apparent Orphan. Privacy Policy Pipe Terms of Use 600 Townsend Street, San Francisco, California 94103. Email was sent to 808crappy@gmail.com. Unsubscribe Pipe. Manage your email settings. Download the app, Google Play Pipe App Store.